You found your way to Whispers of Crimes, a quiet corner where the shadows of the past are gently told. Here, we speak of real crimes and mysteries, not to shock or scare, but to wonder, to reflect, and maybe to help you fall asleep. So close your eyes, let your thoughts slow down, and come with me into tonight's case. In a small town in Nebraska, a young man lived a secret that would cost him his life. His name was Teena, but who was he really? What happened on that cold winter night would shock a nation and expose a dark truth about hate, identity, and justice denied. This is the story of Teena, a story that still echoes today. Chapter 1: Brandon's Early Life, A Fight for Identity. Teena was born Teena Renee Brandon on December 12, 1972, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was assigned female at birth, but identified as male throughout his life. Brandon's father died in a car crash just before he was born, leaving his mother Joanne to raise Brandon and his older sister Tammy alone. From childhood, Brandon was described as athletic, charming, and rebellious. He attended Catholic schools and later Lincoln Northeast High School. Teachers and students noticed Brandon dressing in masculine clothes and adopting traditionally male mannerisms. While some peers saw Brandon as a tomboy, others noticed that his behavior aligned with a deeper, more consistent gender identity. Brandon rejected his assigned sex, describing himself to friends and acquaintances as male. By his late teens, he introduced himself to others exclusively as Brandon. Struggling with a conservative community and an unsupportive home environment, Brandon dealt with rejection early. His mother continued to refer to him using his birth name and misgendered him consistently, dismissing his identity as a phase. Despite these challenges, Brandon pursued an independent life. He tried to enlist in the Army, but was rejected after revealing he was transgender during the physical examination. Emotionally and financially unstable, Brandon drifted from place to place in search of safety and acceptance, often resorting to check fraud to survive. Chapter 2: A New Start in Falls City, Love and Lies. In the early winter of 1993, Brandon moved to Falls City, Nebraska, a small, working-class town near the Kansas border. There, he assumed a new life, introducing himself as a man and quickly integrating into a tight-knit group of locals. Among them were ex-convicts John Lauder and Tom Nissen, both of whom had lengthy criminal records and violent tendencies. Brandon also met 18-year-old Lana Tistel, a local woman who soon became his girlfriend. Brandon was charismatic, funny, and appeared to many as a good guy. He told Lana he was a man, had undergone a sex change operation, and was awaiting legal documentation to reflect that. Lana accepted him and introduced him to her family. Her mother, Leslie Tistel, also came to see Brandon as her daughter's boyfriend. However, cracks in Brandon's story began to emerge. He had a habit of running afoul of the law through forged checks and petty theft. On December 19, 1993, Brandon was arrested for check fraud. At the time, Falls City Police processed his intake under his birth name, outing him publicly as transgender. The Tistel family and others in the community learned Brandon was not assigned male at birth. The betrayal deeply affected Lana and enraged Lauder and Nissen, who felt deceived and embarrassed. It is important to emphasize that Brandon was not trying to deceive in malice. Rather, he was navigating a world that left little room for authenticity. The hostile reaction to his identity reveals more about the society around him than any deception on his part. Chapter 3: The Assault, a Crime Ignored. On the night of December 24th, 1993, Christmas Eve, Brandon attended a party with Lauder, Nissen, and others. At some point, Lauder and Nissen lured Brandon to a remote location under the pretense of settling the tension between them. Once isolated, the two men forcibly removed Brandon's clothing, assaulted him, and discovered his anatomy, which they claimed confirmed their suspicions. They then forced him into a car and took him to a house where they raped and brutally beat him. Afterward, they made Brandon shower, threatened to kill him if he went to the police, and left him bloodied and traumatized. Despite the horror he endured, Brandon found the courage to report the rape to the Richardson County Sheriff's Office. He also went to the hospital, where a rape kit was administered and visible injuries were documented. Yet, when Brandon spoke to Sheriff Charles Locks, he was not treated as a victim of a heinous sexual assault. Instead, the sheriff's focus shifted toward Brandon's gender identity. Locks repeatedly misgendered him during the official interview, asked invasive questions about his body, and dismissed the case as a lover's quarrel. Even though both Lauder and Nissen were questioned and reportedly admitted to the assault, neither was arrested. The sheriff cited insufficient evidence as his reason, but critics argued that Locke's prejudice toward Brandon influenced his decision. Days passed. Brandon went into hiding, fearing for his life. He stayed with Lisa Lambert, a friend of Lana's who offered him shelter in her rural farmhouse just outside Humboldt. Chapter 4: New Year's Eve Murders, Hatred Unleashed. On the night of December 31st, 1993, just 1 week after the assault, Brandon's fears came true. Lauder and Nissen, aware that Brandon had reported them, were determined to silence him permanently. Armed with a pistol and fueled by rage, they drove to Lisa Lambert's rented home where Brandon had been staying. Inside were Brandon, Lisa, and Philip Devine, Lisa's 22-year-old boyfriend, and a black man visiting from Iowa. What happened next was pure horror. Lauder and Nissen burst into the house, confronted Brandon, and began a brutal attack. Brandon was stabbed and then shot in the chest. Philip Devine and Lisa Lambert were also shot and killed, likely as collateral to eliminate witnesses. Brandon's body was discovered the following day. His murder was not just a personal attack. It was an act of rage rooted in transphobia, toxic masculinity, and systemic failure. At just 21 years old, Brandon Teena was dead murdered for being who he was. Lauder and Nissen were arrested shortly after. Nissen, facing capital murder charges, agreed to testify against Lauder in exchange for a life sentence. Lauder was convicted of murder in 1995 and sentenced to death. He remains on death row today. In contrast, Nissen received life in prison without parole. Chapter 5: A Legal System That Failed Twice. The legal system failed Brandon both in life and in death. First, the sheriff's office refused to protect him, ignoring confessions from his rapists. Second, hate crime legislation at the time didn't recognize gender identity as a protected category. Brandon's murder was not prosecuted as a hate crime, despite the obvious motive. Sheriff Locks was never formally punished for his negligence, but the public scrutiny was fierce. During interviews, Locks displayed shockingly dismissive attitudes, referring to Brandon with slurs and brushing off the rape as nothing much. His recorded statements became critical evidence of how law enforcement bias directly endangered Brandon's life. Brandon's mother, Joanne Brandon, filed a civil lawsuit against Richardson County for wrongful death, citing gross negligence by the sheriff. In 2001, Nebraska's Supreme Court ruled in her favor, awarding her nearly $100,000 in damages. Although the payout was symbolic compared to the loss, the court acknowledged that Brandon's murder could have been prevented. Chapter 6: The Psychology of Hatred, Why They Killed Him. To fully understand the brutality Brandon faced, we must examine the psychological profiles of his killers and the broader cultural climate. Lauder and Nissen embodied traits commonly associated with violent offenders: histories of criminal behavior, substance abuse, controlling tendencies, and poor impulse control. But more specifically, their violence was ignited by what psychologists call identity threat. Brandon's existence disrupted their narrow view of gender and sexual norms. When their own masculinity felt threatened by their past association with him, they reacted with hyper-violence. This is a recurring pattern in anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes, where the discovery of a person's sexual orientation or gender identity provokes extreme overreaction, often labeled the trans panic or gay panic defense. Add to that the absence of legal consequences for their earlier crimes, and the result was a deadly storm of impunity, ignorance, and unaddressed prejudice. Brandon's murder was not spontaneous. It was premeditated and fueled by a culture that gave them permission to see him as less than human. Chapter 7, Legacy, Legislation, and the Long Fight Ahead. Brandon Teena's death marked a watershed moment in the history of LGBTQ rights in America. His story reached a global audience with the release of the 1999 film Boys Don't Cry, which won Hilary Swank an Academy Award. But beyond Hollywood, Brandon's murder galvanized activism. It led to national calls for hate crime legislation that included protections for gender identity. The case played a direct role in the eventual passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2009, signed into law by President Barack Obama. It was the first federal law in the U.S. to explicitly protect individuals targeted due to gender identity. Yet the violence continues. Transgender individuals, especially trans women of color, remain disproportionately victimized. According to the Human Rights Campaign, dozens are murdered each year in the U.S., and the vast majority of their cases go unsolved. Brandon Teena's story reminds us not only of the stakes of visibility, but of the necessity of justice. He was not a symbol, not a stereotype. He was a person. A young man who wanted to love and be loved, and who paid the ultimate price for daring to be himself. That's all for tonight's story. Another thread in the web of true crime, quietly unraveling as the night goes on. If you're still with me, thanks for listening. And if sleep has already taken you, may your dreams be peaceful and your mind at ease. I'll be here next time by the fire with another story waiting to be told. Good night, and don't forget to lock your doors.